that we're grateful for each and every one of you. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. The air was crisp, the kind of stillness that begged for reflection. But for Ron, it only underscored the chaos spiraling out of control in his life. He stood in the driveway, staring at the house he and Linda had built together. Every brick, every nail, every stroke of paint represented the 12 years of a marriage that now felt like a cruel illusion. The night before played on an endless loop in his mind, every word Linda said searing like a hot iron. "I'm going on a date," she had declared. Not as a question, not seeking permission, but as a fact, a line drawn in the sand. He hadn't yelled, hadn't begged. He simply stood there, his mind reeling, as she explained her reasoning in the detached tone of someone justifying a trivial purchase. "I need to feel alive again," she'd said, her eyes glinting with a mix of defiance and hope. "You're okay with this, right, Ron?" The words tasted bitter as they left her lips, but she said them anyway. Ron's silence was heavy, deliberate. Then he finally spoke, his voice calm, but sharp as a blade. "Linda, you've already made your decision. What does my opinion matter now?" Her shoulders eased, as though his lack of protest had validated her choice. "I love you, Ron," she said softly, almost pleading. "But I need this. I'll make it up to you. You'll see." His jaw tightened. "So, you know what's wrong then?" Her expression faltered, her confidence cracking for the first time. "What do you mean by that? Do you think our parents would be okay with this?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Do you think they'd look at what you're doing and feel proud?" She didn't answer. Her gaze fell to the floor. "You know it's wrong, Linda," he continued, lowering his voice. "You just don't want to admit it." Her tone shifted to defensive, a feeble attempt to reclaim control. "But you said I could do it, Ron. You said you couldn't stop me." He shook his head, the weight of betrayal anchoring his resolve. "That's not the same as agreeing. Don't twist my words to justify your actions." Her face hardened, her arms crossing in defiance. "You're overreacting. You've always given me what I wanted." Ron took a step closer, his tone steady but colder than ice. "I can't stop you from making a mistake, Linda. But I can warn you. Every choice comes with consequences. And this one will too." Linda spent the next day preparing for her so-called date. Her excitement was palpable as she tried on dress after dress, each one tighter, flashier, more provocative than the last. Ron watched silently from the periphery, his calm demeanor unshaken. By evening, she descended the staircase wearing a black dress he'd never seen before. The fabric hugged her frame in all the ways she wanted him to notice, but he refused to give her the satisfaction. "Damn it, Ron," she said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You look good. Where are you going?" "Out," he replied flatly, slipping into his freshly pressed blazer. "Out where?" She pressed a sharp edge in her voice. He smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth curling in defiance. "Did you expect me to sit here and wait for you to come home after meeting him?" Her face flushed, but she held her composure. "Fine, go ahead. Just don't let your ego ruin this." He walked past her, pausing only to open the garage door. "Don't worry about me, Linda. Just remember, choices have consequences." Without waiting for her response, he left, the sound of his car engine drowning out her words. Ron's destination wasn't random. He had spent the past few months growing close to Ava, a colleague who had been a quiet source of understanding and comfort. That night, they met at a cozy wine bar, its dim lighting and smooth jazz creating the perfect atmosphere. Ava greeted him with a warm smile that reached her sparkling eyes. "You look sharp," she said, her voice teasing but sincere. "Figured I'd try something different," he replied, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, weaving between work, life, and everything in between. Ava laughed at his quirks in a way Linda never had, her laughter soft but genuine. When she reached across the table to touch his hand, he didn't pull away. For the first time in months, Ron felt seen, not as a failure or a placeholder, but as a person who mattered. When he dropped Ava off at her apartment, she leaned in close, her lips brushing his cheek. "Go get her, Ron," she said playfully, her smile a mix of mischief and warmth. When Ron returned home later that night, The house was quiet, but Linda's car was in the driveway. The sight of it filled him with a grim sense of curiosity. She had returned, but what did that mean? As he stepped inside, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, still dressed in her black cocktail dress. Her makeup was smudged, her hair slightly disheveled, but it was the look in her eyes, wide, confused, almost desperate, that caught his attention. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her composure cracking. Ron shrugged off his blazer and hung it neatly on the back of a chair. "Out," he replied evenly. "Out where?" she pressed, her tone rising with suspicion. "That's none of your business," he said flatly, his voice calm but unyielding. Her face twisted with frustration. "None of my business? You left without saying anything." He let out a bitter laugh, leaning casually against the counter. "And did you tell me where you were going tonight, Linda?" She froze, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. "Should I ask if you use protection, or should I just stop caring altogether?" He continued, his voice cutting but measured. "Because honestly, it doesn't matter to me what you did or who you were with. I'll never touch you again." Her expression crumbled, tears welling up in her eyes as her lips quivered. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't hesitate. "Her name's Ava," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "And if marriage is about dressing up for someone else, I figured I'd see how it felt to do the same. The only difference is, I'm upfront enough to tell you her name." Her tears broke free, streaking her cheeks with dark trails of mascara. "You're just trying to hurt me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You want me to feel jealous?" Ron shrugged again, his tone detached. "I'm just giving you the honesty you've given me." Her sobs grew louder, her body trembling as the weight of his words sank in. For a fleeting moment, regret flickered within him, but it was quickly drowned out by the memories of her betrayal. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He exhaled deeply, letting the silence stretch before answering. "Now you figure out what you want, and I'll do the same. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a lawyer. We'll divide everything and move on." Her muffled cries followed him as he climbed the stairs to the guest room. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, sunlight seeped through the guest room curtains, pulling Ron from a restless sleep. He lay still for a moment, the events of the previous night fresh in his mind. He reached for his phone and dialed Jason, an old college friend and a skilled attorney. "Jason, I need your help. It's urgent." "Say no more," Jason replied. "Let's meet this afternoon." After a quick shower, Ron dressed in a crisp shirt and jeans, ready to face the day. As he walked downstairs, he found Linda sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and exhausted from a sleepless night. "Ron," she said hesitantly, her voice shaky. "Can we talk?" He smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Go ahead, Linda. What do you want to say?" She bit her lip nervously. "I'm sorry about last night. I shouldn't have gone out. It was stupid, and I never meant to hurt you." Ron's expression remained cold. "Didn't mean to hurt me," he echoed. "Linda, you made a deliberate choice. You decided that whatever you were chasing mattered more than us." Her shoulders slumped, and fresh tears filled her eyes. "I thought I wanted something different," she said, her voice cracking. "But I was wrong. Please, Ron, give me another chance." He shook his head, his tone unwavering. "Another chance? Do you really think I'm that naive?" Without waiting for her response, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. At Jason's office, Ron laid out everything: the betrayal, the fallout, and his decision to move on. Jason listened carefully, nodding as he took notes. "If you're certain, we can start the process today," Jason said. "We'll file the necessary paperwork. If she challenges it, we'll escalate." "Do it," Ron said firmly. Each signature on the documents felt like another piece of closure being carved into stone. But Ron wasn't just looking for closure. He wanted consequences. That afternoon, he met Jake, a longtime friend with a knack for handling delicate matters. Over coffee at a quiet diner, Ron outlined his plan. "The target is Kevin South," he said, his voice low but resolute. "He's the man Linda thought was worth throwing everything away for." Jake smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Consider it handled," he said simply. "No one crosses you, Ron. Not without consequences." That night, Ron parked a few blocks away from Kevin's apartment complex. He needed to see it for himself. Jake and his crew were efficient. Kevin's car sat in the lot, or what was left of it. The windows were shattered, the tires slashed, and the paint scraped away in jagged streaks. Inside, every surface was coated with an unholy mix of glue, glitter, and baby powder. It was chaos incarnate. From his vantage point, Ron watched as Kevin emerged from the building. His confident stride faltered when he saw the wreckage. He froze, his jaw slack, his face a mask of disbelief. Ron didn't move, didn't blink. As Kevin seethed, fumbling for his phone to call the police, Ron felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. This was just the beginning. The following morning, Ron woke early. The events of the night before felt like a distant echo, but the satisfaction from seeing Kevin's car destroyed lingered. Kevin had crossed the line, but it wasn't just Kevin. This was about Linda, about the consequences of her choices. As Ron walked down the stairs, the silence in the house felt oppressive. Linda was still asleep, her body curled up in their bed, completely unaware of the reckoning that was unfolding. Ron stepped into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the divorce papers he'd placed neatly on the counter earlier. His lawyer had already made the process seamless, ensuring that Linda wouldn't have a chance to delay things. He had given her every opportunity to fix things, but she had chosen to throw it all away. Now it was time to close that chapter of his life. He dialed his lawyer's number. "Morning, Jason. It's done. Let's move forward. File everything today." As he hung up, a sense of finality settled over him. Linda had no idea how far the consequences would stretch. By noon, Ron's phone buzzed incessantly. Texts, missed calls, and voicemails, each one from Linda. He ignored every single one. As he sat in his new, temporary office space, working through some details for a side project, a text from Ava popped up. "How's the day going? You okay?" For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. "Better than okay," he texted back, finally getting some closure. A few moments later, his phone rang again. This time it was Linda's number. He let it go to voicemail. But soon after, there was a knock at the door. Ron opened it to find Linda standing there, her face pale, eyes puffy from crying. Her clothes were rumpled, as if she had thrown them on in a panic. "Ron," her voice trembled as she took a step forward. "Please, we need to talk. I've been thinking about everything. I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. I know it's too late, but I need you to understand." Ron didn't say anything immediately. He didn't feel the need to. Everything she said now felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to reclaim control of a situation she had no right to influence. "I warned you, Linda," he finally said, his voice steady. "Every choice has consequences. You're getting exactly what you asked for." Her face crumpled, her tears returning in full force. "Please, Ron, I never wanted this. I didn't think it would go this far." "You didn't think?" Ron's voice grew sharper. "Did you even consider me in this? Did you think about the damage you'd cause?" She reached out, her hands trembling as she grabbed his sleeve. "Please, I love you. I always have." Ron pulled away slowly, his gaze cold. "You don't get to say that anymore, Linda. You chose someone else. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." She collapsed into a chair, her sobs echoing through the quiet room. Ron didn't feel the need to comfort her, not anymore. There was nothing left to say. He turned away from her and walked to the door. "I've already made my choice," he said softly, though his words cut through the room. "Now it's your turn." As the days passed, Linda's attempts to reach him continued. Texts, calls, even emails, he didn't respond. He had done everything he could to avoid confrontation, but Linda was relentless. She showed up at his office, at his gym, and even outside his apartment. He continued to shut her out, but each visit grew more desperate, her facade cracking further. The once confident woman he had known seemed to disappear, replaced by a frantic shell, constantly searching for any way back into his life. One afternoon, as he was leaving work, Linda cornered him in the parking lot. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice shaky. "Ron, please. You have to understand. I've been so stupid. I never realized what I had until it was gone." He stopped in his tracks, letting the silence stretch between them before he responded. "You've had plenty of time to think, Linda. You've had plenty of chances to fix this. But now it's too late. His tone was final. Linda's hand shot out, gripping his arm. I'm sorry. I don't care about anyone else. I care about you. I always have. You have to believe that. Ron didn't flinch this time. He pulled his arm away gently, his gaze hardening. I don't need your apology. You've made your choices. You just didn't realize how permanent they were. Without another word, he got in his car and drove away, leaving Linda standing there in the parking lot, her sobs muffled by the distance growing between them. The divorce process moved quickly. Linda fought it at first, hiring a lawyer to contest the terms, but Ron had anticipated her every move. The legal battle was swift and efficient. Jason, his lawyer, handled everything with an unflinching precision that made Linda's attempts at manipulating the situation seem childish. After everything had been finalized, Ron didn't feel relief. He didn't feel joy. But there was something else, a weight lifting off his shoulders that had been dragging him down for far too long. He called Ava that night, just to hear her voice. Hey, he said softly. I've taken care of everything. You're free now, Ava said, her voice warm with understanding. How do you feel? Ron smiled faintly, glancing out of the window. I feel like I can breathe again. A few weeks later, Ron moved into a small townhouse near his office. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every corner of it was his choice, his space. It was the beginning of something new, something he had almost given up on. Months passed, and Ron slowly rebuilt his life. He focused on his work, spending time with his children, and deepening his relationship with Ava. The pain of the betrayal never fully left him, but it no longer defined him. One evening, as he walked through the park with Ava, he realized how far he had come. They stopped by a bench, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the city. I never thought I'd be here, Ron, Ava said quietly, her hand resting on his. He looked at her, his heart swelling. Me neither. But sometimes life forces us to take a step back, so we can move forward. As they sat there, the world around them felt different, lighter. Ron had healed, not just from the pain of Linda's betrayal, but from the emotional shackles he had unknowingly put on himself. And as he looked to the future, he knew one thing for certain. This time, he was in control. Ron's life had transformed. What had once been a prison of shattered trust and betrayal now felt like a landscape of possibility. His children were thriving. His relationship with Ava had grown deeper, and his work had flourished. Yet, the echoes of Linda's choices still lingered in the corners of his mind, though they no longer held any power over him. A year had passed since the divorce. Ron had taken the time to rebuild not just his life, but his entire sense of self. It was no longer about revenge, nor about the bitterness that had consumed him in the early days of separation. It was about moving forward, not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with Ava, his phone buzzed on the counter. He reached for it, half expecting it to be one of the kids or perhaps a colleague. But when he saw the name on the screen, his stomach sank. Linda. A heavy silence fell between him and Ava. He glanced at her for a moment before answering. There was no point in avoiding it. Hello? He answered, his voice calm but guarded. Ron. Linda's voice trembled on the other end of the line, filled with guilt and hesitation. I need to talk to you. Ava's gaze never left him. She knew. She had known for months that Linda would reach out eventually. It was a sad inevitability. I don't think there's anything left to say, Linda, Ron replied, his tone steady. Please, just hear me out, she begged. I've tried to move on, but it's been harder than I ever imagined. I've made so many mistakes, Ron. I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I just want you to know that I've realized what I lost, what I took for granted. Ron closed his eyes for a moment, the familiar pain of betrayal rising in his chest. But he had already moved past this. You made your choice, Linda, he said softly, but with finality. And I've made mine. We can't go back to what we were. A long pause followed, the silence heavy between them. I know, Linda whispered. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I regret everything. Ron's eyes met Ava's, and she smiled softly, understanding exactly what this moment meant. He had faced his past head-on and had come out stronger on the other side. I wish you the best, Linda, Ron said, his voice firm. But I'm moving forward with my life. It's time for both of us to let go. The call ended. Ron set the phone down, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before he looked at Ava. That was it, he said, his voice finally showing a hint of emotion. I'm done with that chapter. Ava took his hand, her fingers entwining with his. You've come so far, Ron. I'm so proud of you. A sense of peace washed over him. He had finally closed the door on Linda, truly closed it, and was ready to walk into the future he had been building. As the months passed, Ron and Ava continued to grow closer. They spent weekends hiking, exploring new places, and building a life together that felt natural, full of love, respect, and honesty. The scars of the past, though still present, had faded into something manageable. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Ron's townhouse, watching the city lights below, Ava turned to him, her eyes sparkling. You've come a long way, she said softly. From that man who sat in silence while Linda made her choices, to the man who's here with me now. Ron smiled, his heart light. I had to go through the fire, but it's made me who I am, and I'm proud of that. He reached out and pulled her close, his arms wrapped around her as they gazed out into the night. There was no longer any need for bitterness or regrets. The phone rang again, but this time it was a call he hadn't expected. Hello, Ron answered. Ron, it's Kevin South. His voice was raw, and Ron could almost hear the exhaustion in his words. I need to apologize for everything. For what happened with Linda. For crossing the line. Ron's expression remained neutral, but a small part of him felt a sense of vindication. Kevin, too, had paid a price for his actions. Apology accepted, Ron said. But remember, consequences always follow choices. Kevin fell silent on the other end, and Ron could feel the weight of his words settle in. I'll take it from here, Ron said before hanging up. He turned to Ava, who had been listening. Another piece of the past finally done with. Ron and Ava's relationship continued to deepen, and as they built their life together, Ron realized that what he had once seen as a painful end was actually a beginning. He bought a small house on the outskirts of the city, a fresh start. It was completely his, and in that space he found the freedom that Linda had once sought. It wasn't the freedom of escaping responsibilities. It was the freedom that came with self-respect, with knowing that he could navigate life on his own terms. A few years later, he sat with Ava in the same park where they had once shared their first quiet conversation. The memories of his past seemed so far away now, like a distant storm that had passed, leaving behind clear skies. This place feels different now, Ron said, his voice low but content. It's peaceful. Ava nodded. It's like everything we've been through has led us here, together. And now we have a future. Ron looked at her, and for the first time, he realized that the scars of his past were no longer just reminders of pain. They were also marks of resilience. I never thought I'd get here, he said softly. But I'm glad I did. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally home.